Good morning, second grade. Welcome to our first virtual ELA lesson. My name is Mrs. Rideout, and I'm going to be teaching your lesson for this week. So let's get started. Today, we're going to be learning about story elements. We're going to be learning how to identify characters, setting, and plot in a story. So today's ELA objective is I can identify story elements by focusing on the characters, setting, and plot in a story. Let's take a look at this anchor chart that talks about story structure or story elements. All stories have characters, which is at the top, a setting, which is in the middle of the anchor chart, and a plot that is at the end of the anchor chart. So when looking at the characters, I just want you to take a moment to just glance at it and see what characters can be. And then we'll discuss it further on the next slide. Let's look at the settings part of this anchor chart. And let's look at the plot part of this anchor chart. Let's move forward and discuss each part of this anchor chart. Characters. You can identify characters by focusing on who is in the story. Characters can be the following. Characters can be people, such as your mom, your dad, your grandpa, grandma. It could be a culture of people, such as African Americans or Indians. Or it can be a character that has a name. Characters can also be in stories in the form of animals, such as cats, dogs, bears, birds. And the last way characters can show up in stories is in the form of things, such as a chair, a book, a spaceship, things like that. So I want you to keep that in mind when you're focusing on how to identify a character in a story. Now let's talk about the setting in a story. The setting in a story is when and where a story takes place. In some stories, there may be multiple settings. When does the story take place? For example, does it take place in the morning, the afternoon, the evening? Is it winter, spring, summer, or fall? Is it during lunchtime? Is it during bedtime? When does the story take place? And then, where does the story take place? Sometimes stories happen in different settings. Sometimes the settings can be things such as school, at a playground, somewhere in space, at a lake, in a forest, and even at a castle. Let's take a look at our slide about the plot of a story. The plot is what happens in the story. What are the actions or events that happened at different parts of the story? When you're thinking about a plot in a story, I want you to focus on the action and events in the beginning, the middle, and the end of a story. If you take a look at this slide and the anchor chart part on it, it tells you first, next, and last down at the bottom. And if you look at the illustration, it's a drawing of a roller coaster. So a plot is sort of like a roller coaster. When you first get in it, you're excited. You don't really know what's going to happen, but you're like excited about getting to the top of the roller coaster so you can see how it feels before you get to the end of the ride. So in the beginning, it's a little slow moving. It's introducing your characters and the settings and all the things that, the story is going to be about. And as you start in the beginning, you start inching up to the middle of the story. And when you get to the middle of the story, that's normally where your actions are starting to happen, events are starting to occur, and the plot of the story is starting to form. And then once you get to the middle and you start coming towards the end of the book, this is where whatever is happening in the story is starting to play out and it's starting to be solved, and the end is starting to come, and you're going to find out how the story ends. So, when you think about the plot of the story, I want you to think about again all the actions, all the events that are occurring with the characters in the beginning of the story, in the middle of the story, and what happens at the end of the story. Our wrap up for today. Today we focused on story elements. The characters. Who is the story about? The setting. When does the story take place? And where does the story take place? And don't forget, stories can have multiple settings. In a story, the setting can begin at daytime or in the morning, and it can end in the evening. Or the setting may start inside a school, but it may end outside on a playground. So always pay attention to how the settings are changing and switching in your stories. And last, we talked about the plot of a story. Remember, the plot is the actions or events that are occurring in the story, and you're going to focus on what are those things in the beginning of the story, what are those things that are happening in the middle of the story, and what are those things that are happening at the end of the story. So before we close with this week's lesson, I want to remind you about what good readers do. The first thing a good reader does is visualize. That means while you're listening or reading a story, you should always be forming pictures in your imagination, in your mind, about the characters, the events, and the settings in the story. The second thing you should be doing is forming your I wonder questions. You should always be wondering why a character does something. Why did this happen? Why did that happen? And when you do so, it'll be a great help when you're trying to figure out what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end of a story, which is called the plot. And the last thing, you should always be thinking about what you are reading, because then when you're thinking, it's easy for you to form those I wonder questions. This week's reading is going to be Chester's Way on Storyline Online. I hope you enjoy listening and hearing the story, and I hope these last few tips that I gave you about what good readers do will help you to be able to complete your online lessons successfully this week. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed your first virtual ELA lesson. I look forward to doing many more with you. Bye.